Hello and welcome to the video. My name is Wade Smith. And unfortunately for alarmist climate scientists, there's a few that aren't alarmists just for the hell of it, but there are many that are alarmists just for the hell of it because they make money off of terrifying people. Uh, Ocean acidification has happened countless times in the geologic record, including the five great mass extinctions. At least three of the five great mass extinctions were ocean acidification events. Um, the two worst of which were the Permian mass extinction and one other one that turned, which the Permian mass extinction turned the ocean into apparently overcritical carbonic acid, and due to some reason that they've never actually fully discovered. And the other one was, I believe, the Siberian traps, which have ultimately turned the ocean into sulfuric acid when the Siberian traps burned. It released so much sulfur dioxide that it turned the oceans into sulfuric acid. But here's the thing: carbonic acid is a very weak acid. As I recall, it's only got a pH of about 5 at maximum concentration. As a matter of fact, you can drink it and it tastes really good. It's called soda pop. Okay? So, it doesn't kill you. And in fact, the doctor once prescribed my sister to drink it when she was suffering from drink Coke when she was suffering from uh, phosphate depletion from her adenine triphosphate being depleted from her chemotherapy. The doctor told her to drink Coke so that it's good for you. Imagine that. And it's maximum concentration carbonic acid and phosphoric acid. So, it's not the end of the world if the ocean's pH drops by 1/100th of a point. It's not. That's peanuts compared to what's happened in the fossil record, and it's not going to wipe out all life on Earth and all this other nonsense. When they did this in a laboratory where they tried to kill the animals in a test in a laboratory, a third of the animals were unaffected by acidifying the oceans to 1,200 parts per million carbon. Another third died because they were eaten by the other third, and another third actually grew faster and got healthier in a higher concentration of acid in the ocean. So they kind of disproved their own theory. And we're not going to turn the ocean into 1,200 parts per million acid anyway. That is so far off that it's silly. We're going to either die from some other cause before then, or we're going to invent something cleaner than carbon fuels by then. Because that would be like 800 years in the future. But you can't even say that one volcano cools the earth and another volcano warms the earth, which is the truth. The Nova Rupta volcanic eruption was very rich in sulfur dioxide, so it reflected the sunlight and cooled the earth when Nova Rupta happened. When Tonga erupted, which was a similar size eruption, it mostly released carbon dioxide and water vapor into the atmosphere, which warmed the earth noticeably over the next couple of years since that's already happened. Matter of fact, we went from producing just over 2 parts per million CO2 per year to after the 2 years after the Tonga eruption, it jumped 3 some odd parts per million per year, which means that the volcano released 50% more carbon dioxide than all human activities in an entire year in one day for 2 entire years. You understand what I'm saying? In one day, in about 5 minutes. But the geologists had to admit that Tonga actually warmed the Earth, even though volcanoes like Pinatubo and Nova Rupta had cooled the Earth whenever they erupted, because it's a different type of magma and a different type of gas coming out of the magma. The gas is even more important than the magma itself because sulfur dioxide reflects sunlight, whereas carbon dioxide traps heat. And people don't understand how big the Earth's atmosphere is. That we release about 2.3, I think, other than the last 2 years. We don't know exactly how much of it is Tonga and how much of it is human activity changing. But we release about 2.3 parts per million CO2 per year into the atmosphere. And, but the atmosphere is over 10 to the 15th tons of oxygen and nitrogen. That's over 10 quadrillion tons of oxygen and nitrogen. So a billion tons is nothing compared to a quadrillion tons. And in comparison, like Mars has more CO2, even though its atmosphere is only about 100th the pressure of the Earth. Mars has more CO2 in its atmosphere than all of Earth's atmosphere combined. And Venus has hundreds of times more total atmosphere, 100 times more total atmosphere than the Earth, and it's almost entirely made of carbon dioxide with some sulfur dioxide in it. And so you can't say, well, look at Mars. Mars actually died because of global cooling, not global warming, in spite of having a carbon dioxide atmosphere. Mars died from global cooling from the core outward, from the inside out, because the core died. It then lost its magnetic field, and then the sun blew away the atmosphere, most of the atmosphere anyway. So it died of global cooling. Venus has never been anything other than a blazing inferno in a hell. There's no evidence that there could ever be life on the surface of Venus because it's so hot that it melts lead on the surface of Venus. So, for example, when Nancy Pelosi was like, look at Mars, it changed and everything else. Yeah, and it had absolutely nothing to do with humans or life or anything else like that. The planet's core died from the inside out because it wasn't massive enough to support a dynamo. It's only 1/9 the mass of Earth. It has absolutely nothing to do with CO2 or lack of CO2. It would have happened if the atmosphere had been made of fluorine or some other molecule or atom. Mars absolutely died of global cooling, even though its atmosphere is almost 100% carbon dioxide. So it has nothing whatsoever to do with climate change. So comparing Mars to Earth just meant that she didn't know what the hell she was talking about that day. And that's been about 10 years ago that she made that comment on the news. But it's like that. The politicians need to not talk about things if they don't know what they're talking about. Especially when they're spreading alarmism. And Michael Mann's hockey stick hasn't happened. Sorry. Matter of fact, the Antarctic quit melting 2.5 years ago and started gaining ice again. And the high Arctic in the northern hemisphere has not lost net sea ice loss in the past 13 years. It suddenly dropped off from 2008 to 2012 for no known reason other than the wind direction changed a couple times. And then it stopped melting after 2012 and hasn't melted again, at least not that bad. So why don't the alarmists admit when their data doesn't fit their theory? Because in the past 12 years, 13 years, the data has not fit the theory. And I'm not saying that global warming doesn't happen or isn't happening. It's just much more open to interpretation than these people would have you to think. Some scientists actually think that the Earth can support more life if it's warmed by a couple more degrees Celsius, which ought to be pretty obvious. I mean, certainly in the Arctic and Antarctic, if they melted down, you would actually be able to have more life forms living in Greenland and Antarctica than just the most extreme life forms that live there now. I'm not saying that I want that to happen because, my home state would be totally flooded if the whole planet melted down like that. And so would Florida, because I live in Louisiana. And current projections show that most of Florida and most of Louisiana would be totally flooded if, in fact, 400 to 1,000 years from now, Antarctica melted down. which I'm not saying that I want that to happen because I don't. But the point is, it's not all bad just because the temperature rose a degree in the past 200 years. 200 years ago, they used to starve to death in winter because they couldn't have enough food and it got so cold that they'd freeze to death or starve to death. You couldn't find food and you couldn't find the shelter warm enough to keep you warm. And that was abnormally cold because the actual temperature now is about what it was supposed to be over the long term, according to the medieval warm period temperature. They argue over whether it's slightly warmer now or slightly cooler now. Who knows? Because you didn't have thermometers back then. But they try to claim that mud cores is all they need, which is also BS. But while I'm on this, let's talk about something else about hurricanes. Uh, some people think that quantum computers are going to be some kind of magic fairy tale solution to all human problems, and they absolutely are not. First of all, we now know that human brains are quantum computers, which Roger Penrose has been saying for decades anyway, because the classical computer couldn't be contained in the human brain strong enough to do everything we do correctly. But second problem is, for example, if you wanted to forecast hurricanes with a quantum computer, you would actually need to know quantum precise data to go in the quantum computer. And you'd actually need to know a quantum theory of how hurricanes actually function. How do the photons all end up spinning to the right or counterclockwise rather to make the hurricane spin counterclockwise? How does all the heat energy end up organizing into counterclockwise spin at a quantum level? There's a Coriolis effect, which explains that the Earth's spin imparts the angular momentum to the storm, but that doesn't tell the whole story because the heat is what does the real driver in a hurricane. So the heat has to somehow be biased to begin with, even when it's leaving the sun, much less sitting around in the ocean and whatnot, and then going into the atmosphere. And I once asked Dr. Jeff Masters, who was one of the 3 leading hurricane experts in the world, how would you use a quantum computer to forecast a hurricane? And even if you had a quantum computer of maximum power. And I was like, since you don't know how to explain how the heat ends up biased at a quantum level to counterclockwise spin in the northern hemisphere and clockwise spin in the southern hemisphere, and these other problems. And he was like, well, we don't really have a quantum theory of how hurricanes work. And I was like, bingo. But if quantum theory is true, everything's supposed to be determined by quantum mechanics on some level or another. So bingo, you don't understand hurricanes at all. You just think you do. That's why the computer models, one run, the computer model will be telling you that the current hurricane is going to be a category 5, and then another run, it'll be at a category 3, and then another run, it'll be at a category 1, and then another run, it'll be back at a category 5 again. And you don't know what to think by watching the computer models because they have a different output every run. And the experts aren't that great at experts anyway. They're only about 60 to 70% accurate on track and no better than that on intensity. And 50-50 would be a coin flip of just guessing at it, would be a 50-50 science. So if you're only 60% accurate on your forecast, you're barely better than guessing at it. That's how little we actually understand about hurricanes. Or the climate. And yet these nuts are trying to tell you to fear the climate change and stop driving automobiles and turn off your electricity. And I live in Louisiana, the state that has more fresh water than any other 2 states combined, and they want you to not run your water. If Louisiana runs out of fresh water, everyone else in the world is going to starve to death because they'll run out of fresh water a long time before we do. It's like that. They've been saying this stuff ever since I was in the 3rd grade, and it hasn't come to pass yet. When's it going to happen? I'm 44 years old, and they've literally been saying this since I was in the 3rd grade, and it has not happened yet. Haven't even gotten worse either. There's no evidence that hurricanes are getting stronger. The two strongest hurricanes on record in the Atlantic are still the 1935 Labor Day hurricane and Hurricane Allen, which happened a year before I was even born. The strongest landfall in world history is still the Labor Day hurricane by pressure, although not by wind speed. But they don't know what the real wind speed was. They think it was a 185 sustained. But based on pressure, it's still the strongest landfall in world history. And that was 90 years ago, before most of the global warming and pollution supposedly happened. If you have a theory, the problem with theory is required to make sense and continue to make sense even when new data and new facts are presented. And the new data shows that the Antarctic is not rapidly melting. It melts a little and then it refreezes a little. It melts a little and then it refreezes a little. Same goes for the high Arctic in the northern hemisphere. So it's not when 2008 through 2012 happened, all the alarmists thought that it was just going to melt completely off and plummet and cause the end of the world within a couple years. And they even tried to deceive me and with some success into believing that. And I'll admit that. But in hindsight, it's been 13 years since 2012, and it has not. And not only has it not melted that bad again, but it's actually recovered some since then. So, can we stop with the alarmism about ocean acidification and ice melt and all this other stuff? It's happening so slowly that you could crawl on your belly. If you started at the coastline, you could crawl on your belly like a snake and escape sea level rise in one day and get away from where it would be for the next 10 years. Easily. I mean, what the heck? You could get away within 10 minutes from where it would be in 10 years. It's only rising about a couple inches per decade. That's the supposed global average, which is actually being biased by subsidence in the Gulf of Mexico. Because about twice the global average is happening in the Gulf of Mexico due to subsidence, not due to actual base sea level rise. So, for example, they say that the sea level is rising about 5 inches per decade in the Gulf of Mexico now. I don't know how they come up with that number, but I'm not going to dispute that number. But it's actually subsidence. That's not base sea level rise, because the global average is not even 2 inches per decade. Although it might reach 2 inches per decade over the next couple of decades, you see, if it does start accelerating again. And then the other thing is carbon dioxide doesn't even absorb all heat that touches it. It absorbs 15 microns infrared, but it actually reflects visible light. And if you don't believe me, every time they do a smoke generator machine at the Super Bowl and at football games, that is carbon dioxide coming out of the smoke generator. That's what smoke is, carbon dioxide. And lo and behold, carbon dioxide reflects white light, which is every bandwidth of visible light. So about half of the sun's energy is visible light, and the other half of the sun's energy is infrared. And the CO2 only absorbs 15 microns infrared, but it reflects all visible light. So it may even actually be producing net cooling on the Earth, for all I know, because they're not measuring that correctly. They just measure the one band that it absorbs and say, aha, we got more CO2 than ever before. So what? We've had bigger volcanic eruptions than ever before, too, recently. They can't even tell us how many human beings are living on the earth. I saw an article on MSN a couple weeks ago that was claiming that there might be as many as 10.5 billion people alive on the earth already, because they think some countries are not doing their census data correctly, namely China and Brazil. Where if China has 3 billion people living in it and they only think there's 1.5 billion people, they need to learn how to count. God help us. But this was a legitimate article anyway, not necessarily a legitimate science. Because if you can't tell the difference between 8.5 billion and 10.5 billion, you need to learn how to count. But supposing there are 10 billion people on the earth, I actually did the math one time and found that 1 billion people just breathing and passing gas produces about 1/10 of a part per million CO2 every year. So if we had 10 billion people on the earth, then just breathing would produce one full part per million CO2 per year before we even got into burning fossil fuels. Or what are we supposed to do? Are we going to all hold our breath